There are places in every game where something was given a name, coded into the system, and then quietly forgotten, where a mechanic was designed with intention but arrived without purpose. Generation after generation of Pokémon carries these quiet contradictions, abilities etched into the data of creatures that would never quite benefit from them, rules written into the engine that answered questions though nobody was asking. Some abilities were given to Pokémon already powerful enough not to need help, while others were handed to creatures too fragile to survive long enough for the ability to matter. These are the abilities that drifted close to usefulness before pulling back, the mechanical shadows that exist in every corner of the roster, waiting to be discovered by players willing to read the fine print. And before you drift off any further, please consider subscribing to join the Cozy Club for more journey like this, and let me know where in the world you are currently watching from tonight. The history of Pokémon abilities stretches back to the 3rd generation, when Game Freak introduced the mechanic as a way to give each creature a passive trait that would define how it interacted with the world. The idea was elegant in its simplicity. Every Pokémon would carry something unique, a quality that shaped its role on the battlefield without requiring any direct action from the player. Some abilities redirected damage, some changed weather, some prevented status conditions before they could take hold. The designers were thoughtful in their approach, creating mechanics that rewarded knowledge and punished carelessness. But alongside every useful ability that shaped competitive play for years, there existed another category entirely. Abilities that were designed with a concept in mind, but that failed to translate that concept into anything meaningful in practice. These are not the abilities that dominate tournaments or define team archetypes. These are the abilities that exist quietly, present in the code, listed on every stat screen, and almost entirely without function. Understanding why they exist requires understanding the full scope of what the designers were attempting, and that understanding begins in the places where ambition and execution did not quite meet. There is something deeply fascinating about a mechanic that was created with care but arrived without impact. The designers who wrote these abilities were not careless. They were working within a system of enormous complexity, balancing hundreds of creatures against each other, managing type interactions, stat distributions, move pools, and generational shifts that could change the meaning of any mechanic overnight. Every ability that feels useless today was once an idea that someone believed in enough to code, name, and assign. The story of useless abilities is not a story of failure. It is a story of the gap between intention and outcome, a gap that appears in every creative system, complex enough to surprise its own creators. Tonight, we will move through that gap slowly, pausing at each ability long enough to understand not just what it does, but why it exists and what it reveals about the enormous, as intricate world of Pokémon design. The most direct category of useless ability is the one that actively harms the Pokémon carrying it. These are abilities that reduce a creature's effectiveness in battle rather than enhancing it, abilities that function as penalties rather than rewards. The first and most well-known of these is Truant, an ability that allows the Pokémon possessing it to act only every other turn. The Pokémon moves, then loafs around, then moves again, cycling through a rhythm that cuts its effective output in half compared to any other creature on the field. The concept behind Truant was never subtle. It was designed as a narrative mechanic, a way of expressing through gameplay something about the nature of the Pokémon carrying it. Slaking is one of the strongest normal type Pokémon ever designed, with a base stat total that rivals legendary creatures and an attack stat that threatens to overwhelm most opponents in a single hit. The designers looked at that enormous power and decided it needed a counterbalance, something that would prevent Slaking from dominating every battle it entered. Truant was that counterbalance, a built-in restriction that forced the creature to rest between its moments of devastating activity. The logic was sound. Sloths are slow and deliberate animals, creatures that conserve energy with remarkable efficiency. The idea of translating that biological reality into a game mechanic made a certain kind of sense. A Pokémon based on a sloth would move on its own schedule, not the player's. The execution was playful, and the intention was clear. But the consequence of Truant is that slaking, despite its extraordinary base stats, has never found meaningful competitive use. A Pokémon that acts half as often as its opponents is not a Pokémon that can sustain pressure, respond to threats, or take advantage of favorable matchups. The one turn it spends loafing around is a turn that any opponent can use to set up, switch in a counter, or simply deal damage that slaking cannot immediately answer. The restriction is not balanced against the power. It overwhelms the power entirely. Strategies have been proposed across the generations to work around Truant, ways of transferring the ability to an opponent or neutralizing it through specific move combinations. Certain moves can remove or overwrite an ability mid-battle, and theoretically, a sufficiently clever player could use slaking to pass Truant to an opponent's Pokémon, leaving their own slaking free to act every turn. The problem is that these strategies require multiple turns of setup, specific move selections, and an opponent who does not simply switch out and reset the conditions entirely. In competitive play, a strategy that requires 3 turns of setup to enable one Pokémon to function normally is not a strategy. It is an aspiration. Truant remains one of the most famous ability penalties in the entire game, not because it is the most harmful, but because it is the most visible, attached to a Pokémon that could have been extraordinary and instead became a symbol of untapped potential. A few generations after slaking, a very different kind of Pokémon received the same ability. Durant is a steel-type insect with respectable speed and solid attack, a creature that carves out a niche in certain formats through its aggressive offensive presence. Its hidden ability is Truant, and unlike slaking, Durant does not receive any compensating boost in power that would make the penalty feel proportionate. The reason Durant exists with Truant is not narrative, but mechanical. Durant can learn a move called entrainment, which transfers its ability to the target. The theoretical application is clear. A Durant with Truant uses entrainment on an opponent, passing the loafing restriction to that creature and leaving it unable to act consistently. The strategy even has a name in certain circles, and for a brief period, it was discussed as a genuinely interesting niche. The problem, as always, is that the opponent simply switches out. When a Pokémon leaves the field, its ability resets to its original state. The Durant has used a turn, possibly taken damage, and accomplished nothing permanent. The Truant strategy with Durant is clever in concept and hollow in practice, an idea that sounds better in description than it performs in execution. Slow Start is an ability that shares the philosophy of Truant without quite sharing its thematic clarity. Where Truant was designed to reflect the biology of its original bearer, Slow Start feels more like a corrective measure, a designer's response to the perceived problem of a Pokémon being too powerful. Regigigas is a legendary creature of enormous historical significance within the Pokémon world, the being said to have towed continents with ropes and shaped the physical geography of the known regions. Its base stat total reflects that mythology, sitting high enough to place it among the most powerful non-mythical creatures ever designed. And yet, for the first 5 turns it remains on the battlefield, Regigigas operates at a fraction of that power. Both its attack and its speed are halved during that period, not reduced from the base stat, but reduced from the final calculated stat, meaning the actual numbers the game uses in battle are cut dramatically. A Regigigas that has just entered the field hits with the force of a mid-tier normal-type Pokémon and moves no faster than creatures a fraction of its legendary status. The period of diminishment is not brief. 5 turns is an enormous stretch of time in competitive Pokémon, where entire battles can conclude in 3 or 4 exchanges. Keeping Regigigas on the field long enough for Slow Start to expire requires a level of protection and support that most teams cannot provide without significant cost to themselves. And if Regigigas is forced to switch out before those 5 turns complete, the counter resets entirely, requiring another full cycle of impotence before the legendary creature finally operates at its intended capacity. The design feels punishing in a way that Truant does not. Truant at least has thematic coherence. Slow Start feels like a handicap applied to a creature that did not need to be handicapped, a legendary Pokémon made unreliable in a way that serves no narrative purpose that the game communicates clearly. The result is a legendary creature that spent most of its competitive existence as a curiosity rather than a presence, interesting to read about and largely impractical to use. There was one brief period when Slow Start became slightly less prohibitive, during a specific game format where the conditions of battle allowed for protective strategies that could shelter Regigigas long enough for its ability to expire. Even then, the strategies were elaborate and the results inconsistent. The designers have since acknowledged the difficulty of Slow Start in various ways, but the ability remains, a permanent feature of a legendary Pokémon that most players encounter once and then quietly retire to a box. The contrast between what Regigigas represents in the lore and what it offers in practical use is one of the starker examples of the gap between narrative ambition and mechanical execution in Pokémon design. It is a creature of mythological power made functionally mediocre by a single ability that never quite made sense. One other Pokémon received Slow Start as a hidden ability, and the circumstance is gentle enough to carry a trace of humor. Varum is a small, engine-themed Pokémon introduced in a later generation, a creature whose entire design concept is built around the energy and acceleration of a revving motor. Its name evokes the sound of an engine turning over. Its aesthetic is built around speed and mechanical power. Giving Varum a hidden ability called Slow Start is the kind of quiet irony that Pokémon designers occasionally allow themselves, a wink embedded in the data for players who read carefully. Fortunately, Varum evolves into Revavrum, and that evolution comes with a different hidden ability entirely, one that offers genuine competitive application. The Slow Start is a brief inconvenience for Varum, rather than a defining limitation, a passing phase that the creature sheds when it reaches its final form. The designers allowed themselves the joke without allowing it to cause lasting harm. Defeatist is an ability that operates differently from Truant or Slow Start, but arrives at a similar destination. Where those abilities restrict a Pokémon from the beginning of battle, Defeatist waits until the creature has already taken significant damage before imposing its penalty. When the Pokémon's HP falls below half, both its attack and its special attack are cut in half as well, a dramatic reduction that arrives precisely at the moment when the Pokémon most needs to be able to fight back. The ability belongs to the fossil Pokémon Archon and its evolution Archeops, creatures whose base stats are exceptionally high for Pokémon of their tier. Without Defeatist, Archeops would be one of the most powerful offensive Pokémon available to players in the generations where it appears. Its attack and special attack are both remarkable, and it possesses enough speed to act before most opponents. The design is a creature built for explosive offensive pressure, a dinosaur bird that hits hard and moves fast. But Defeatist changes the trajectory of every battle Archeops enters. Rather than being a Pokémon that can sustain offensive pressure across multiple turns, Archeops becomes a Pokémon that must end battles quickly or accept that its power will be taken from it. The ability creates a time limit, a threshold beyond which the creature ceases to function offensively in any meaningful way. A player using Archeops must always be aware of how much HP remains, always calculating whether the creature can survive the next hit without falling below the line where its power collapses. The mental weight of managing that threshold is significant, and any opponent aware of the ability will deliberately aim to reduce Archeops to exactly the point where Defeatist triggers and then allow the now weakened creature to linger on the field, harmlessly occupying a team slot while the opponent proceeds untroubled. The ability converts one of Archeops' most useful qualities, its impressive natural bulk at full health, into a liability. The design choice behind Defeatist carries a certain thematic resonance that Slow Start lacks. Archon and Archeops are fossil Pokémon, ancient creatures revived from a time long past. The idea that such a creature might falter when pushed to its limits, that its ancient physiology cannot sustain damage the way more modern Pokémon can, has a kind of narrative logic. A creature out of its time, capable of tremendous power when fresh but unable to maintain that power under prolonged stress. Whether that thematic intention excuses the practical frustration of the ability is a question that players who have watched a high-speed Archeops become entirely harmless after one strong hit tend to answer in the negative. The ability is not without logic. It simply makes the Pokémon carrying it deeply unreliable in competitive contexts, where reliability is often more valuable than ceiling. There are fan-made games and community projects that have revisited Archeops' design, removing or replacing Defeatist to allow the creature to function as its base stats suggest it should. In these contexts, Archeops becomes exactly as powerful as its numbers promised, an aggressive offensive force that justifies every resource invested in it. These alternate versions of Archeops have been received warmly by players who always suspected the creature was more than Defeatist allowed it to be. They are right. The base design is excellent. The ability is the single point where that design fails to translate into competitive viability, a door left locked just as the player reaches for the handle. Klutz is an ability that sits in a different category from the previous three because it was not designed for narrative reasons or as a direct penalty on an otherwise powerful Pokémon. Klutz prevents the Pokémon carrying it from receiving the in-battle effects of any held item, while still allowing the item to remain in the Pokémon's possession for purposes like friendship growth or trade evolution triggers. A Pokémon with Klutz can hold leftovers without recovering any health. It can carry a choice band without receiving any boost to its attack. It can be equipped with any number of powerful items and receive absolutely nothing from them in battle. The ability functions as a complete removal of the held item system for any Pokémon unfortunate enough to possess it. What makes Klutz more puzzling than the previous abilities is the profile of the Pokémon that carry it. Truant and Slow Start and Defeatist were at least given to creatures with exceptional power, Pokémon so strong that some kind of restriction felt internally consistent to the designers, however imperfectly executed. The Pokémon that carry Klutz are not exceptional in that way. They are normal, occasionally modest creatures that have no particular need to be limited and no compensating strength that the limitation is meant to balance. There are 12 different Pokémon species across the generations that can have Klutz as one of their abilities, and every single one of them has at least one other ability option that functions without penalty. Klutz is never the only choice. It is always the worst choice among available options. This raises a question that becomes more pressing the longer one thinks about it. Why does Klutz exist at all? The theoretical applications are present, as they are for most abilities in this category. A Pokémon with Klutz can hold a Flame Orb, a held item that would normally inflict a burn at the end of each turn, without suffering that burn itself. Then, through certain moves that transfer held items to opponents, the Pokémon can pass the Flame Orb to an enemy, burning the opponent while the Klutz-carrying Pokémon suffers no consequence from the item it briefly held. The strategy is creative in the way that most niche strategies are creative, built from an unusual combination of mechanics that produces an outcome no single mechanic was designed to achieve. But like every other strategy built around a fundamentally limiting ability, it requires multiple turns of setup, specific move selections, and an opponent who does not recognize what is happening and act to prevent it. In the vast majority of battles, Klutz simply means the Pokémon cannot use a held item. Nothing more. The ability exists and almost nobody chooses it. Stall is an ability so specific in its function and so unfortunate in its recipient that it occupies a small but memorable corner of Pokémon ability history. The ability causes the Pokémon carrying it to always move last within any given priority bracket, regardless of its speed stat. A fast Pokémon with stall becomes functionally the slowest Pokémon on the field, always acting after both opponents and allies have taken their turns. The concept has theoretical applications in specific formats and under specific conditions, most obviously in Trick Room battles, where the fastest Pokémon move last and the slowest Pokémon move first. A Pokémon with stall, the reasoning goes, would be perfectly positioned for Trick Room, always moving last in normal conditions, and therefore first in Trick Room, combining with that field effect to become a surprisingly powerful presence. The problem is that stall does not interact with Trick Room the way that logic suggests it should. Within Trick Room, stall still functions, still forces the Pokémon to move last within its priority bracket. In normal battle conditions, the Pokémon with stall moves last. In Trick Room, the Pokémon with stall still moves last. The ability does not flip. It simply ensures that wherever movement order is determined, this Pokémon ends up at the bottom. The single Pokémon that received stall as a main ability is Sableye, a Ghost Dark type creature with a base stat total of 380, placing it firmly in the lower tiers of Pokémon power. Sableye's primary value as a competitive Pokémon has always rested on its unique typing, which before the introduction of fairy types gave it no weaknesses at all, and on its ability to use priority moves to disrupt opponents before they can act. That disruption depends entirely on moving before the opponent, and stall removes that possibility entirely. The hidden ability that Sableye received in later generations is Prankster, which gives priority to status moves, allowing Sableye to act before most opponents, even when its modest speed would normally force it to wait. Prankster transformed Sableye from an interesting curiosity into a genuinely threatening presence in certain formats. The gap between Prankster Sableye and Stall Sableye is enormous, two abilities attached to the same Pokémon producing entirely different competitive identities. The question of why Stall was created specifically for Sableye, why a new harmful ability was introduced and given exclusively to a Pokémon that had no compensating power to balance against it, does not have a satisfying answer. It exists, it was assigned, and players who discovered it tended to feel a quiet bewilderment that is not entirely faded, even as later generations have made Sableye considerably more interesting through other mechanical pathways. The ability Slow Start was followed across the generations by a family of abilities that do not harm their Pokémon directly, but render them functionally inactive. These abilities were designed exclusively for doubles formats, battle situations where two Pokémon on each side face each other simultaneously, allowing for complex interactions between allies and opponents that single battles do not permit. In doubles, abilities that affect allied Pokémon become meaningful. Supporting a partner, boosting an ally's damage output, protecting adjacent Pokémon from specific threats are all functions that have genuine value in a format where two creatures share the field at once. The trouble arises when a Pokémon has only doubles exclusive abilities and is placed in single battle, the default format for most of the main story experience and a significant portion of competitive play. In that context, an ability that affects allies has no allies to affect. It exists in the Pokémon's ability slot, listed on its stat screen, and does nothing whatsoever. Charjabug is a middle-stage evolution of a bug-type Pokémon, existing in the space between its charming early form and its powerful final evolution. Its only ability is Battery, a doubles-exclusive effect that raises the special attack of adjacent allies by 30%. In singles, where there are no adjacent allies, Battery achieves nothing. It sits in the ability slot as a placeholder, a mechanic waiting for a format that single battle play never provides. Charjabug does evolve, and that evolution brings with it a different ability that functions across all formats, so the limitation is temporary. But for as long as a player is using Charjabug specifically, the ability provides no benefit against any threat the player actually faces. Mega Audino presents a more complicated version of the same problem. Audino's Mega Evolution comes with the ability Healer, which grants a 30% chance at the end of each turn to cure a status condition affecting an adjacent ally. In doubles, this is a potentially valuable form of passive support, reducing the long-term impact of burns, paralysis, and sleep without requiring the player to spend a turn actively using a move to address those conditions. In singles, there are no adjacent allies. Healer has nothing to heal. The ability sits unused every turn, occupying the space that might otherwise hold something meaningful. A player who has Mega evolved their Audino has committed to using that Mega slot for this form, and in singles, the commitment comes with a passive ability that provides no return. The frustration is softened slightly by the fact that players can choose not to Mega evolve, keeping a regular Audino with its original abilities, but the Mega form itself is compromised by a singles experience that its ability was never designed to serve. Stonejourner is a Pokémon whose entire competitive identity has been shaped by this exact problem. Its only ability is Power Spot, a doubles-exclusive effect that increases the power of adjacent allies' attacks by 30%. In doubles, this makes Stonejourner a platform for other Pokémon rather than a threat in its own right, a creature whose value comes entirely from the boost it provides to its partner rather than from any direct offensive contribution. In singles, Power Spot has no allies to boost, no partners to amplify, no function whatsoever. Stonejourner in singles has no ability. The slot is occupied, but the mechanic is inert, a piece of the game's architecture that serves no purpose in the format where most players first encounter the creature. The base stats are not insufficient, but without any ability to augment its presence, Stonejourner must compete purely on those numbers, which are not quite high enough to compensate for the absence of any passive trait. The Florges line presents perhaps the most striking example of this problem because it does not have one doubles-exclusive ability. It has two, and neither functions in singles. The abilities available to Florges and its pre-evolutions are Symbiosis, which passes a held item to an adjacent ally when that ally consumes theirs, and Flower Veil, which prevents grass-type allies from having their stats lowered by opponents. Both abilities require allies. Both abilities specify particular types of allies for full functionality. In singles, neither ability does anything at all. The Florges line cannot even claim the modest consolation of having one useful option in singles and one useful option in doubles. Every ability available to those Pokémon is inert in the format that most players use most often. This represents the most complete version of the doubles exclusive ability problem. A Pokémon designed so thoroughly around one format that it arrives without any mechanical function in another. Flower Veil carries an additional layer of irony worth examining carefully. The ability protects grass-type Pokémon on the user's side from having their stats lowered. Florges is a fairy type. Despite its floral appearance, its elaborate petal-based aesthetic, and its deep thematic connection to flowers and gardens, Florges is not a grass type. Flower Veil cannot protect Florges itself from stat drops because Florges does not qualify as the type the ability is designed to protect. The ability that defines Florges' identity in doubles is an ability from which Florges is explicitly excluded. It can shelter a grass-type ally. It cannot shelter itself. In singles, where there are no allies to shelter, the ability's exclusion of its own carrier becomes the most visible feature of a mechanic built around generosity that cannot extend inward. There is a final category of useless ability that represents the purest distillation of the concept, abilities that do not merely fail to help in certain formats or penalty-specific situations, but do absolutely nothing in any normal battle scenario whatsoever. These abilities are not conditional. They are not limited to specific formats. They simply do not produce any meaningful effect under ordinary conditions, existing in the game code as mechanics without application, names attached to functions that never get called upon. The most famous of these is the ability belonging to one of the Rotom forms, and understanding why it is useless requires a brief look at how that form's design changed between generations. Rotom is a ghost electric Pokémon capable of inhabiting different household appliances, with each form producing a different secondary type and a different signature move. When forms were introduced in one generation, all of them shared the electric ghost typing, and all of them carried Levitate, an ability that removes the ground type weakness that electric Pokémon would otherwise carry. Levitate made sense for every form because every form shared the same electric typing and therefore shared the same vulnerability to ground moves. In the following generation, the types of the forms changed to reflect their appliances more specifically. The washing machine form became electric water. The heat form became electric fire. Each form's typing now reflected the appliance it had inhabited. Rotom Fan became electric flying. Flying types are immune to ground-type moves. Levitate also grants immunity to ground-type moves. Rotom Fan is immune to ground moves twice. The second immunity accomplishes nothing that the first immunity does not already accomplish. Levitate, one of the most classically useful abilities in competitive Pokémon, is completely without function on this single form because the form's typing already provides what the ability was designed to provide. The typing is not useless. Electric flying is a reasonable combination that provides access to powerful flying type attacks and the immunity to ground moves that electric types always welcome. But Levitate does nothing that the typing does not already do. The ability slot is occupied by a mechanic that was useful in a previous generation and became redundant when the form's type changed to render it unnecessary. It is not that Levitate is a bad ability. In isolation, Levitate is excellent. On Rotom Fan specifically, it is precisely as valuable as having no ability at all. Stunfisk offers a different version of the same problem, one that emerged over time rather than arriving through a type change. Stunfisk is an electric-type Pokémon introduced in one generation with the ability Limber, which prevents the Pokémon from being paralyzed. Paralysis is a particularly threatening condition for electric types because it reduces the afflicted Pokémon's speed by half and gives it a chance to fail to act each turn, both of which are meaningful threats, regardless of the Pokémon's type. Giving an electric-type Pokémon an ability that prevents paralysis made practical sense at the time. Then, a single generation later, the game mechanics changed. Electric-type Pokémon were made universally immune to paralysis as a type-based characteristic, in the same way that fire-type Pokémon are immune to burns, and poison-type Pokémon are immune to poison. The immunity became a property of the type, rather than a property of any individual ability. Stunfisk, as an electric type, is immune to paralysis. Stunfisk's ability Limber also makes it immune to paralysis. Since the type already provides complete protection, the ability provides nothing. Limber is not harmful, it is simply present and inert, a mechanic that existed before the system that made it redundant and was never updated to reflect the change. The quiet humor in Stunfisk's situation is the suggestion that a player, unaware of the type immunity, might equip it with a Lumberry just in case it gets paralyzed anyway. The caution is understandable. The Lumberry is unnecessary. Stunfisk cannot be paralyzed, and not because Limber says so. Heavy metal and light metal are abilities that make a Pokémon heavier or lighter respectively, interacting with a small set of moves whose power depends on the target's weight. Weight-based damage is a mechanic that has always occupied the fringes of competitive play, available but rarely central, a tool that appears in move pools and occasionally finds use against specific targets without ever defining a meta or driving widespread strategic decisions. Heavy metal doubles the carrier's weight, which can increase the power of weight-based moves the carrier uses and increases the damage those moves deal when used against the carrier. Light metal halves the carrier's weight, doing the reverse in both cases. The asymmetry between the two abilities is notable. Heavy metal at least makes the user's own weight-based moves stronger, offering a genuine, if situational, offensive application. Light metal's beneficial effect is limited to reducing the damage taken from two specific moves in the entire game, Grass Knot and Low Kick, 2 moves. In a game with hundreds of moves available across all generations, light metal specifically reduces damage from exactly 2 of them, and only when those moves are targeting the Pokémon with light metal. The number of battles where an opponent uses either of those specific moves against the specific Pokémon carrying light metal is small. The number of battles where the outcome hinges on whether that damage was reduced by light metal is smaller still. The ability is not impossible to benefit from. It is simply rarely relevant, a mechanic that answers a question posed by a tiny fraction of competitive encounters. But Metagross carries light metal as a hidden ability, and Metagross's specific situation turns even this modest benefit into something approaching nothing at all. Metagross, in its standard form, is one of the heaviest Pokémon ever designed, weighing over 550 kilograms, more than 1,200 pounds in conventional terms. Grass Knot and Low Kick both scale their damage based on how heavy the target is, reaching maximum power against targets that exceed 200 kilograms. Metagross exceeds that threshold by an enormous margin in its normal form. When light metal halves Metagross's weight, the result is still more than 270 kilograms, still comfortably above the maximum damage threshold for both moves. Light metal reduces Metagross's weight significantly and achieves nothing in terms of the damage it takes from Grass Knot or Low Kick. The 2 moves that light metal specifically reduces damage from still deal maximum damage against Metagross even after the ability takes effect. The ability that was supposed to protect against weight-based attacks cannot protect Metagross because Metagross is too heavy for the reduction to bring it below the relevant threshold. The precise irony of Metagross's situation is that light metal was designed to help heavy Pokémon take less damage from moves that punish weight, and Metagross is so extremely heavy that the help cannot actually reach it. The ability is present, listed in the data, available to any Metagross with the hidden ability slot, and in the vast majority of encounters, it does absolutely nothing. The only exceptions are so niche as to be essentially theoretical Conditional on opponent choices, so specific that accounting for them in team building would be impractical. A player who inherits a metagross with light metal is advised to find an ability patch. The practical suggestion is not harsh. It is accurate. Beyond these specific examples, there is a broader pattern worth examining, a tendency for certain abilities to be designed around mechanics that the rest of the game never quite develops enough to make the ability genuinely useful. Normalize is an ability that converts all of the user's moves to the normal type, which receives a power bonus of 20% to compensate for the conversion. In theory, Normalize could be powerful if a Pokémon had a wide enough move pool and a strong enough attack stat to take advantage of the boosted normal type power. In practice, converting all moves to normal type means losing the advantages of type coverage entirely. A Pokémon with Normalize cannot use fire-type moves against grass types for a super effective hit, cannot use sus-electric-type moves against water types, cannot exploit any of the fundamental type advantages that shape how teams are built and how battles are decided. The 20% power increase does not compensate for the loss of coverage. Normalize removes one of the primary tools available to Pokémon trainers and replaces it with a modest flat bonus that rarely justifies the trade. The Pokémon that carry Normalize include Delcatty, a normal-type creature with modest stats that already struggles to find a competitive niche in generations where it appears. Normalize does not provide the tools Delcatty needs to distinguish itself. It removes options that most Pokémon would prefer to have. The ability is not without use in the most extreme edge cases, where a specific interaction between Normalize and another mechanic produces an outcome that no other approach could achieve. Those cases are discussed in certain corners of the competitive community with the same quiet enthusiasm that any highly niche strategy produces. They are not common, that they are not reliable. They are the kind of thing that works once in 100 battles and produces a satisfying screenshot rather than a consistent win record. Color change is an ability that transforms the carrier's type to match the type of any move that hits it. The concept suggests a kind of adaptive camouflage, a Pokémon that reshapes its elemental identity in response to incoming attacks. In practice, color change usually results in the Pokémon becoming the type it was just hit by, which means the next attack of the same type, if it comes, will be resisted rather than hitting neutral or super effectively. The protection is reactive rather than proactive, changing the Pokémon's type only after damage has already been taken, and it shifts in a direction that may or may not be advantageous depending on what the opponent plans to use next. A Pokémon with color change that is hit by a fire-type move becomes a fire-type, which means the next fire-type move is resisted. But if the opponent switches to a water-type move, the now fire-type Pokémon is suddenly vulnerable in a way it would not have been before. Color change does not protect against the move that triggers it. It potentially helps against the next move of the same type, while creating new vulnerabilities to types that would previously have been more manageable. The ability is uncertain in its benefits and consistent in its costs. Klutz, examined earlier as a harmful ability, also contains within it a slightly different version of uselessness. Even setting aside the deliberate strategy of passing harmful items to opponents, the ability occasionally produces situations where the restriction it imposes creates a layer of management that simply adds complexity without adding depth. A player who forgets their Pokémon has Klutz and equips it with a useful item will notice only in battle that the item does nothing. The ability does not announce itself loudly. It simply withholds the benefit, quietly, without explanation in the moment of need. This kind of hidden mechanical restriction is frustrating in a way that more visible penalties are not. Truant announces itself clearly every turn. Klutz is invisible until the moment its absence of function becomes relevant. There are abilities that exist within legitimate mechanical frameworks, but whose interaction with the specific Pokémon carrying them produces something close to meaninglessness. Runaway is an ability that guarantees escape from wild Pokémon battles, allowing the carrier to flee without being prevented by blocking abilities or moves. In trainer battles and all competitive formats, Runaway has no function at all. It applies only to wild encounters and only to the act of fleeing, a mechanic that is already largely available to most Pokémon without any ability assistance. The Pokémon that carry Runaway receive a guarantee that they could almost always achieve without it, in situations where the act of fleeing is rarely the strategically complex choice. Runaway does not harm the Pokémon carrying it. It simply offers a benefit that most players will never need, and that competitive play renders entirely invisible. Illuminate is an ability that raises the encounter rate for wild Pokémon when the carrier leads the party. In an era before the various mechanics that allow players to precisely target specific encounters or avoid random encounters entirely, Illuminate had a functional niche. Players who wanted to grind experience or search for specific wild Pokémon could place an Illuminate Pokémon at the front of their team and increase the frequency of encounters. Even within those older games, the practical value of Illuminate was limited. Players who wanted more encounters could simply walk through grass without any ability assistance, and the increase in encounter rate provided by Illuminate was rarely significant enough to change the pace of grinding in a meaningful way. As later generations introduced mechanics that gave players direct control over which Pokémon they encountered and when, Illuminate became not just niche, but essentially purposeless. The problem it solved was never urgent, and the game outgrew it. Honey Gather is an ability that occasionally produces a held honey item at the end of battle, providing a small consumable that serves as an encounter lure in certain contexts. The ability has no in-battle function. It does not affect how its carrier performs in any fight. It simply produces a small resource that the player can collect afterward. In competitive play, Honey Gather occupies an ability slot while doing nothing to affect the outcome of any battle. In casual play, it produces a minor convenience that most players encounter once, note with mild interest, and then largely forget about. The Pokémon that carry Honey Gather tend to be early game creatures with limited competitive applications regardless, so the ability fits naturally into their design without creating significant disappointment. The lack of battle application does not feel like a failure in the same way that Truant or Slow Start does. It simply feels like an ability that belongs to a different kind of game interaction than the one most players engage with most often. Forecast is an ability that belongs to Cast Form, a Pokémon designed around weather conditions. Cast Form changes form based on the active weather, transforming into different appearances under sun, rain, hail, and sandstorm conditions. The forms are aesthetically appealing, and the concept is charming. Forecast is not useless in the same way that Levitate on Rotomfan is useless. It does something, and what it does directly affects Cast Form's form and its typing, which can influence damage calculations under specific conditions. The problem is that Cast Form's base stats do not support the complexity of its design. A Pokémon that changes form and typing based on weather needs the underlying numbers to justify the investment, and Cast Form's numbers sit at a level that rarely justifies the weather dependence the ability demands. Forecast is not useless in isolation. Combined with Cast Form's actual competitive viability, it becomes an elaborate system in service of modest outcomes, a clever mechanic attached to a Pokémon that cannot fully take advantage of what it offers. The question of what makes an ability truly useless becomes more complex when examined across generations. Abilities that were functional in one mechanical environment became redundant when that environment changed. Abilities that were niche but present became invisible when later systems provided the same benefit more broadly. Some abilities were designed for mechanics that the games subsequently abandoned or dramatically reduced, leaving the abilities technically functional but practically orphaned. The history of Pokémon ability design is partly a history of intentions that outlasted their contexts, rules written for conditions that the game later changed. Minus and plus are abilities that boost the special attack of Pokémon with the opposite ability when both are present on the field simultaneously. In doubles, where two Pokémon share the field at once, a team that includes both a plus user and a minus user gains a special attack boost to both as long as they are both active. The interaction requires specific team building, specific format selection, and an opponent who does not immediately neutralize one of the two Pokémon, collapsing the pairing. In singles, plus and minus do nothing, since there is no ally on the field to complete the required pairing. The abilities are not without merit in the exact format for which they were designed, but the Pokémon that carry them are not sufficiently powerful to justify building around them, and the format dependency means that in the most commonly played competitive format, they offer nothing at all. Anticipation is an ability that triggers a reaction when an opponent sends out a Pokémon that knows a move capable of dealing super effective damage or a one-hit knockout move against the carrier. The reaction is a shudder, a brief animation, indicating that the carrier has sensed a threat. Anticipation does not remove the threat. It does not boost the carrier's stats. It does not provide any mechanical benefit. It tells the player that a threat exists. In competitive play, where players have access to detailed information about what moves common Pokémon typically carry, anticipation provides information that the player likely already has. In casual play, where players may be less familiar with common move pools, anticipation offers a useful warning. But in no scenario does it change the outcome of the threat it detects. It observes and reports without acting. The ability slot produces a piece of information rather than a mechanical change, and most players would prefer a mechanic. Forewarn is the special attack equivalent of anticipation, revealing the strongest move an opponent's Pokémon knows when it enters the field. Like anticipation, Forewarn provides information without producing any mechanical effect. It asks the player to assess the revealed move and make decisions accordingly, offering no direct benefit and no protection against what it reveals. In competitive play, where move pool knowledge is widely available, Forewarn reveals something the player already knows. In casual play, it reveals something the player will soon discover regardless. The ability does not change the game, it annotates it. There is a specific kind of uselessness that belongs to abilities whose application requires conditions the game almost never produces. Normalize can theoretically be exploited through specific move interactions, but the conditions for that exploitation are narrow enough to exclude it from practical consideration. Wonder Guard is the rare inverse, an ability so powerful that the game grants it only to a Pokémon so fragile that the protection barely matters. Shedinja has 1 HP. It cannot take damage from any attack that is not super effective, but any super effective hit, any weather damage, any poison or burn, any residual damage from hazards instantly defeats it. Wonder Guard is extraordinary in concept and catastrophically limited in application because the creature carrying it cannot survive contact with most of the game's environmental mechanics. The ability is not useless, but it is positioned in a way that makes its use deeply conditional, an extraordinarily specific tool that works in a narrow set of circumstances and fails immediately in all others. Pokémon is full of abilities like this, extraordinary in ideal conditions and ordinary or worse in realistic ones. The designers of Pokémon are not unaware of these problems. Across generations, abilities have been revised, updated, and occasionally replaced to address redundancies or inefficiencies that became apparent over time. Some Pokémon have received new hidden abilities that transformed their competitive viability entirely. Abilities that fit their design and their stats in ways their original abilities never quite managed. Other Pokémon continue to carry abilities that do not serve them, updated in stat distribution or move pool, but left with mechanics that were always a poor fit. The pace of revision is not fast enough to address every case, and the sheer number of Pokémon in the game ensures that some will always carry abilities that sit in the useless category, waiting for a mechanical change that may never come. The feedback that flows from the competitive community back toward designers takes time to produce results, and some problems are simply lower priority than others. A legendary Pokémon made useless by a terrible ability may eventually receive an update. A mid-tier creature with a redundant ability may wait several generations before anyone returns to reconsider it. The design team is working at a scale that makes comprehensive revision difficult, and every generation brings new Pokémon with new abilities that require attention before older problems can be addressed. The result is a game where certain abilities exist in a kind of suspended uselessness, present and acknowledged and largely left alone. There is something almost meditative about studying abilities that do not work. They represent the gap between intention and outcome in a particularly visible form. Every ability in the game was written by someone who had a reason for writing it, who believed the mechanic would serve some purpose in some context for some player. The abilities that never fulfill that purpose are not evidence of carelessness. They are evidence of scale, of a creative system operating at a complexity that no team of designers can fully control or predict. The game changes around abilities that remain fixed. Types gain new immunities and leave abilities redundant. Formats shift and leave doubles exclusive mechanics stranded in a singles environment. Creatures evolve out of one ability into another and leave behind a version of the mechanic that no longer fits anything around it. The player who encounters a useless ability for the first time and reads the description carefully tends to pause in a specific way. There is a brief moment of attempting to construct a scenario where the ability might matter, running through hypothetical conditions, imagining opponents and formats and specific situations where the mechanic produces some meaningful result. That pause is the ability doing its most honest work, inviting the player into the complexity of the game's systems, prompting engagement with interactions and conditions that might not otherwise be considered. Even an ability that does nothing under ordinary circumstances teaches something about how the game works when the player tries to figure out why the ability was designed that way. The Pokémon that carry useless abilities are often otherwise unremarkable, creatures whose place in the roster is defined by other qualities, base stats, move pools, type combinations, aesthetic appeal, narrative roles. Rotom Fan, without its redundant levitate, is still an interesting Pokémon, defined by its electric flying typing and its signature move. Stunfisk, without its redundant limber, is still a distinctive creature, a flat electric type with an unusual design and a place in the national Pokédex. The useless ability does not make these Pokémon useless. It simply occupies a slot that could theoretically hold something more useful, a missed opportunity rather than a fundamental flaw. The Pokémon for whom the useless ability is the primary defining characteristic of their competitive identity, those are the ones where the sense of waste becomes more acute. Regigigas with slow start is not a Regigigas with a missed opportunity. It is a legendary creature whose usefulness has been structurally removed, whose power exists in theory and functions in lore, but cannot be accessed in practice without elaborate conditions that most battles do not provide. Archeops with Defeatist is not simply missing out on a better ability. It is a creature whose design as an aggressive attacker is undercut by a mechanic that punishes it for being hit, creating an identity crisis where the Pokémon must choose between playing aggressively, which exposes it to the damage that triggers Defeatist, and playing cautiously, which defeats the purpose of having the high attack stat that made the design appealing in the first place. These are cases where the ability does not merely fail to help, it actively opposes the design intent. The generations of Pokémon have accumulated enough of these cases to populate an entire discussion on their own, and the discussion is not primarily one of frustration, though frustration is present. It is a discussion about how systems evolve, how intentions translate, how the gap between design and outcome emerges in complex creative work. Every game has its redundancies, its outdated mechanics, its features that were functional at the time of their introduction and became irrelevant as the context around them changed. Pokémon is large enough that its redundancies are numerous and specific enough that each one has a story. The story of Rotomfan's Levitate is a story about type changes and their consequences. The story of Stunfisk's Limber is a story about mechanical updates that did not circle back to revise the creatures they affected. The story of Slaking's Truant is a story about designers who correctly identified a balance problem and solved it in a way that was perhaps more permanent than they anticipated. These stories are not just about Pokémon. They are about the nature of design itself, about the difficulty of anticipating how a mechanic will function across multiple generations of change, about the impossibility of predicting which decisions will age well and which will produce quiet obsolescence. The designers who gave Regigigas Slow Start were not failing to think carefully. They were thinking carefully within the context they had, applying the lessons of previous designs, making a decision that seemed proportionate to the problem they were solving. They could not fully anticipate how the competitive meta would develop, how the 5-turn restriction would interact with the specific formats and strategies that later generations would produce. The decision made sense at the time. Its consequences are still being felt. This is one of the more humbling aspects of designing systems at scale. The decisions made in the early stages of a game's development echo forward across years of play, shaping experiences in ways that no designer can fully predict at the moment of creation. An ability designed for one mechanic becomes redundant when that mechanic changes. A creature designed to be powerful within certain constraints becomes obsolete when those constraints are lifted for every creature of the same type. The useless abilities in Pokémon are not monuments to failure. They are markers of time, indicators of where the game was when certain decisions were made and how far it has traveled since. The community that plays Pokémon has developed an unusual relationship with its useless abilities, one that combines genuine frustration with something approaching affection. Regigigas's Slow Start is a long-running reference point in discussions about legendary Pokémon design, invoked whenever the subject of poorly implemented power comes up. Sablei's Stall is cited whenever the conversation turns to abilities that seem designed by someone who did not fully consider what Sableye was supposed to do. Rotomfan's Levitate is a piece of trivia that delights players who encounter it for the first time and produces a kind of fond exasperation in those who have known about it for years. The useless abilities have become part of the cultural texture of Pokémon knowledge, familiar enough that experienced players can invoke them with shorthand, shared reference points in a community built around deep engagement with the game's systems. This cultural familiarity is not accidental. The useless abilities persist, generation after generation, precisely because they are interesting to discuss. They invite the same kind of careful reading that Pokémon rewards in general, the habit of examining stat screens and ability descriptions and type charts with the same attention that one might bring to any complex system. A player who has read every ability description and understands why each one is or is not useful has a detailed and accurate model of how Pokémon battles work. Even the abilities that do nothing contribute to that model, defining the boundaries of what the game's mechanics can and cannot achieve. Understanding why Limber is useless on Stunfisk requires understanding the paralysis immunity rules that govern electric types. Understanding why Levitate is useless on Rotomphon requires understanding how type-based immunities interact with ability-based immunities. The useless ability teaches, even when it does not help. The Pokémon that carry these abilities often carry them alongside alternative options that actually function. Klutz Pokémon always have better abilities available. Normalized Pokémon can usually choose alternatives. The useless ability slot is rarely the only option, which softens the practical impact considerably. A player who understands the system will simply not choose the useless option, selecting the functional alternative and proceeding without disruption. The useless ability exists in the code, visible on the stat screen, but quietly bypassed by anyone who knows what they are looking at. It is the player who does not yet know that sometimes ends up with a Klutz Pokémon holding a choice band and wondering why the attack boost is not appearing. The experience of discovering that an ability does nothing, truly nothing, is a specific kind of Pokémon moment. It comes with a particular quality of stillness, a pause in which the player recalibrates their understanding of how the system works. Usually this happens in the middle of a battle where something was expected to occur and did not. The player checks the ability description. The description seems to describe something. The battle continues without that something happening. The player checks again after the battle, reads more carefully, and eventually arrives at the understanding that the ability was never going to produce what they expected because the conditions for its function were absent. Sometimes those conditions are format specific. Sometimes they are type specific. Sometimes the conditions were removed when the game changed the mechanic the ability was designed around, and the ability simply never received an update to reflect what the game had become. This moment of realization is part of the texture of learning Pokémon. The discovery that the system is complex enough to contain edges and gaps, places where the design was not quite complete or where completeness became inapplicable as the game evolved. Every player who has ever questioned why a specific ability exists or why a specific Pokémon carries it has engaged with the game at the level of systems thinking, asking not just what the game does, but why it does it. Those questions do not always have satisfying answers. Sometimes the answer is that the ability was designed for a context that no longer exists. Sometimes the answer is that the Pokémon was given an ability that the designers thought would balance it, and the balance did not work as intended. Sometimes the answer is simply that 12 Pokémon got Klutz, and nobody seems entirely sure why. The accumulation of these small mysteries is part of what makes Pokémon enduring. A game that can be fully understood in a short time is a game that becomes familiar and then static. A game that contains enough complexity to reveal new puzzles even to experienced players, enough accumulated decision history to produce genuine surprises in what should be simple descriptions, is a game that rewards continued engagement. The useless abilities are part of that reward, not in the sense that they make the game better by being useless, but in the sense that discovering them and understanding why they are useless deepens the player's understanding of the game as a whole. They are puzzles embedded in the system, not deliberately but inevitably, produced by the intersection of design intention and mechanical evolution across many years and many generations. There is one final dimension worth considering as the evening's exploration comes gently to a close, the question of what happens to useless abilities over time. Some are simply left, persistent features of creatures that have been otherwise updated, unchanged while the Pokémon around them shifted. Others have been updated in later generations when the ability was revised or when the Pokémon received new ability options through gameplay mechanics or official distribution events. A small number have been indirectly addressed by changes to the mechanics the ability interacts with, becoming slightly more useful or slightly less redundant when the surrounding system shifted. None of these update paths is guaranteed, and some abilities have persisted in their uselessness across more generations than anyone would have predicted at their introduction. The players who know these abilities by name, who can describe without hesitation why Stunfisk's Limber stopped working, or why Metagross's Light Metal cannot reach the damage threshold it was meant to reduce, carry a particular kind of game knowledge. It is knowledge that does not directly improve their performance. It does not help them win more battles or build better teams, but it represents something genuine about their relationship with the game, a willingness to read carefully, to think about what the system implies as well as what it states, to be curious about the parts that do not work as well as the parts that do. The useless abilities of Pokémon are a reward for that curiosity, a quiet acknowledgement that the game is complex enough to contain things that do not work, and interesting enough that even those things are worth knowing. Every ability that does nothing was designed by someone who believed it would do something. Every Pokémon carrying a useless mechanic arrived in the game through the same process of care and iteration that produced the most celebrated designs in the series. The gap between intention and outcome is not a failure of caring. It is a property of scale, a natural consequence of building systems complex enough to surprise their creators. The useless abilities of Pokémon are, in their own quiet way, evidence of ambition, of a creative project large enough and long-running enough to produce the full range of outcomes, from the extraordinary to the inert. They are the negative space in the design, the elements whose absence of function defines by contrast everything around them that works. There are abilities that exist in interesting tension with the creatures around them, abilities that would be meaningful on a different Pokémon but land on precisely the wrong one for reasons that become clear only upon close examination. Battle Armor and Shell Armor are abilities that prevent the Pokémon carrying them from being hit by critical strikes. Critical hits bypass defensive stat changes and deal significantly increased damage, so immunity to them has genuine value in theory. The Pokémon that carry Battle Armor and Shell Armor include several defensive-oriented creatures, which makes a certain amount of sense. A Pokémon that builds its strategy around high defensive stats and gradual attrition benefits from knowing those defensive stats cannot be bypassed by a critical hit. The problem is the ability called Skill Link, or the relationship between critical hit rate and the Pokémon's overall damage intake, which in most cases means that the scenarios where critical hit immunity becomes the deciding factor in a battle are relatively rare. The abilities are not useless in the way that Levitate on Rotomfan is useless. They produce a real effect under conditions that actually occur, but those conditions occur infrequently enough, and the impact of critical hit immunity is marginal enough compared to the impact of other possible abilities that Battle Armor and Shell Armor tend to sit toward the lower end of ability priority lists for the creatures that carry them. The comparison ability is often Lucky Chant, a move rather than an ability, but one that accomplishes the same thing for the entire team rather than for a single Pokémon. The existence of a team-wide version of the critical hit immunity effect, available as a move that any Pokémon can use, reduces the unique value of an ability that provides the same protection for one creature. When the same benefit is available through a different mechanical pathway that applies more broadly, The single Pokemon ability version is diminished by comparison, not useless, but less necessary than it might otherwise be. Sand Veil and Snow Cloak are abilities that increase the carrier's evasion by 20% during sandstorm and hail respectively, reducing the frequency with which attacks successfully connect. Evasion mechanics are one of the more contested areas of Pokemon design, a source of debate about whether the element of chance they introduce is a strategic tool or a source of unfair variance. In competitive play, abilities that depend on evasion are generally viewed with skepticism because they allow outcomes to be determined by randomness rather than decision-making. An opponent whose attacks miss repeatedly due to evasion increases may lose not because of tactical errors, but because of unfortunate dice rolls. The competitive community has, in many official formats, explicitly banned the items and mechanics most associated with evasion boosting, which leaves Sand Veil and Snow Cloak in an awkward position. In formats where the mechanics are legal, they have occasional use. In formats where they are banned or where the relevant weather conditions are not reliably active, they provide nothing. The connection to weather makes these abilities doubly conditional. Sand Veil requires sandstorm to be active. Snow Cloak requires hail or snow conditions to be active. And weather control in competitive Pokemon has shifted significantly across generations, with weather-setting abilities and their durations changing in ways that have periodically made weather-reliant strategies stronger or weaker. During periods when weather is less central to competitive team building, Sand Veil and Snow Cloak sit inactive on the Pokemon that carry them, waiting for conditions that the current meta does not provide. During periods when weather is strong, they offer a real if contested benefit. The conditional nature of these abilities means their value fluctuates with the meta in a way that most passive abilities do not. There are also abilities that were genuinely useful in the generation they were introduced and became significantly weaker when the game changed the mechanics they interacted with. Cloud9 and Airlock are abilities that suppress all weather effects, preventing weather from providing any benefit or penalty to any Pokemon on the field. When these abilities were introduced, weather was a more binary mechanic, either present and impactful or absent and irrelevant. Suppressing weather in a format where weather-based strategies were central could meaningfully disrupt an opponent's game plan. As weather mechanics have evolved, with different durations, different interactions, and a broader range of weather-setting options, the value of suppression abilities has shifted. Against teams that are not weather-dependent, Cloud9 and Airlock do nothing. Against teams that are heavily weather-dependent, they offer significant disruption. But the frequency of heavily weather-dependent teams fluctuates with the meta, and in many competitive periods, the ability sits dormant against the majority of opponents encountered. The Pokemon that carry these abilities are also relevant. Golduck carries Cloud9, and Golduck's competitive profile does not generally make it a top-tier pick. Rayquaza carries Airlock, and Rayquaza is a legendary creature with extraordinary power, meaning it does not particularly need its ability to provide competitive value. The ability on Rayquaza is interesting from a lore perspective. A creature that literally disperses weather conditions is a defining characteristic of its identity, but in competitive play, Rayquaza's value comes from its base stats and its mega evolution, not from Airlock. An ability that suppresses weather is less useful on a Pokemon that would be excellent regardless of whether the ability did anything. Magma Armor is an ability that prevents the carrier from being frozen. Freeze is one of the more debilitating status conditions in the game, preventing the afflicted Pokemon from acting until it thaws, which is a random event that may take many turns to occur. An immunity to freeze sounds like meaningful protection, especially in generations where freeze was relatively common and the thaw rate was low. The problem is that freeze can only be inflicted by ice-type moves, and Ice-type moves can only freeze targets that are not already immune to them. Fire-type Pokémon are immune to being frozen, as many of the Pokémon that carry magma armor are fire types. The ability that prevents freeze is attached to creatures that cannot be frozen by the type mechanics already governing the game. Magma armor on a fire-type Pokémon is not quite as complete a redundancy as levitate on Rotomfan, because there are edge cases where ice-type damage does not automatically grant immunity, but in the vast majority of encounters, the ability occupies a slot without contributing. Oblivious is an ability that prevents the carrier from being infatuated by the attract condition and from being taunted. The dual protection sounds potentially useful, and in certain specific situations, it is. A Pokémon immune to infatuation can engage with opponents that rely on the attract strategy without any risk. A Pokémon immune to taunt cannot be prevented from using status moves regardless of the opponent's strategy, but infatuation requires the opponent's Pokémon to be of the opposite gender, and attract is not a widely used competitive move, even without ability immunity. The situations where Oblivious provides meaningful protection are narrow enough that most players would rather have an ability that provides consistent benefit across a wider range of scenarios. The taunt immunity is slightly more useful, as taunt sees more competitive play, but the Pokémon that carry Oblivious are often not the kind of creatures whose strategy depends heavily on using status, moves that taunt would otherwise prevent. Inner Focus is an ability that prevents the carrier from flinching. Flinching is a secondary effect attached to certain moves, causing the afflicted Pokémon to lose its turn when hit. The ability sounds like genuine protection, but flinching can only occur when the afflicted Pokémon is slower than the attacker, since it requires being hit before acting in a turn to trigger. A Pokémon that is faster than its opponent will not flinch regardless of whether it has inner focus. A Pokémon that is slower can be protected from flinching by inner focus, but a slower Pokémon is already in a difficult position regardless of whether it flinches. The scenarios where inner focus provides the decisive benefit, where the Pokémon would have lost the battle due to a flinch that inner focus prevented, are real but uncommon. Against opponents not using moves with high flinch rates, or in formats where flinch strategies are rare, inner focus provides nothing. The ability is not useless in the way that levitate on Rotomfan is useless. It prevents something that can occur, but the frequency with which it matters is low enough that most players would prefer an ability that provides consistent benefit in all scenarios, rather than insurance against a specific and relatively rare outcome. Sand Rush and Swift Swim and Slush Rush and Chlorophyll are abilities that double the carrier's speed in specific weather conditions. These abilities are conditionally excellent rather than useless in any complete sense. In the right format with the right team support, they transform Pokémon that would otherwise be too slow for competitive use into genuine speed threats. The uselessness appears only when the weather is not active, when the format does not support weather, or when the carrier lacks the base stats to take advantage of the speed boost even after doubling. Several Pokémon with Sand Rush, for example, have base speed stats that produce meaningful numbers even after doubling in Sandstorm, but have offensive stats that are not quite sufficient to threaten opponents that the speed advantage should theoretically allow them to outrun and hit first. The ability is correct in concept, but attached to a Pokémon whose other numbers do not complete the picture. The pattern across all of these examples is similar. An ability is designed with a real mechanical function. The function is meaningful in certain contexts. But either the context is rarer than anticipated, or the creature carrying the ability lacks the other qualities needed to benefit from the function, or the game changes in ways that reduce the frequency or relevance of the context the ability was designed for. The ability ends up in a zone between useful and useless functional in theory, and forgettable in practice. There are abilities that represent a different kind of design challenge entirely, abilities where the function is clear and real, but where the benefit is so minimal that no player would choose the ability over any available alternative. Pickup is an ability that sometimes produces a held item after battle, drawn from a table that changes based on the carrier's level. The items collected are typically consumables and held items that can be obtained through other means, and the rate at which items are collected is low enough that farming with pickup Pokémon requires many battles to produce a meaningful quantity of any specific item. In casual play, pickup produces occasional pleasant surprises, an unexpected potion or revive appearing in the Pokémon's held item slot after a fight. In competitive play, pickup achieves nothing, since battles do not result in item collection in any useful form. The ability is charming and functional in its context, but it occupies a slot that provides no direct benefit to the Pokémon's performance in any battle. Illuminate, mentioned earlier, is similar. Flash Fire is an ability that redirects fire-type moves to boost the carrier's own fire-type attacks rather than dealing damage. This is a genuinely excellent ability in the right context, providing both immunity to a common offensive type and a meaningful power boost that can define a Pokémon's offensive presence. Flash Fire represents the design philosophy working well, an ability that rewards strategic positioning and type knowledge in a way that makes both offensive and defensive decisions more interesting. The contrast with abilities like Illuminate or Pickup is instructive. Flash Fire has a clear function, a meaningful power boost that activates through a specific mechanic attached to fire-type Pokémon that can use the boost productively. An ability does not need to be complex to be useful. It needs to produce a meaningful effect under conditions that actually occur with reasonable frequency. The contrast also illustrates why some abilities feel more purposeful than others. An ability that rewards knowledge, that activates through specific opponent decisions that the player can anticipate and plan for, feels like a tool. An ability that occasionally produces a low-value item after a battle feels like background noise. Both abilities are part of the game. Both have their place in the mechanical vocabulary. But one produces strategic decisions, and the other produces occasional light surprises, and the gap between them represents the full range of what Pokémon abilities can be. Rivalry is an ability that boosts the carrier's attack by 25% against Pokémon of the same gender and reduces it by the same amount against Pokémon of opposite gender. The logic is thematic, a Pokémon competing more fiercely with rivals of its own gender while being distracted or less motivated against others. In practice, the ability introduces an element of variance that most players find uncomfortable. Because the gender of wild and opponent Pokémon is often random within a species range, rivalry sometimes boosts and sometimes reduces power based on conditions that the player cannot reliably control. Building a strategy around rivalry requires accepting that the ability's effect will be unpredictable in many encounters, boosting when facing the same gender and reducing when facing the opposite. Against genderless Pokémon, rivalry has no effect at all. The ability is not purely negative in the way that Truant is negative. It produces a real power boost under the right conditions. But the conditions are inconsistent enough that most players would prefer a flat power boost or a conditional boost tied to something more predictable. Hustle is an ability that raises the carrier's physical attack by 50% while reducing its physical move accuracy by 20%. The trade is significant in both directions. A 50% attack boost is enormous, transforming otherwise unremarkable offensive stats into genuinely threatening numbers. But a 20% accuracy reduction means that every physical move the carrier uses has an 80% chance of hitting, and in competitive play, An 80% hit rate is a source of variance that many players find unacceptable. A miss at a critical moment can cost a match regardless of how powerful the attack would have been. Hustle is used in certain niche applications, particularly with moves that already have perfect accuracy and do not have their rate reduced by the accuracy penalty, but in general play the combination of high power and unreliable accuracy makes the ability less consistent than a smaller but guaranteed power boost would provide. The abilities that introduce variance, that add randomness to outcomes that would otherwise be determined by decision and stat calculation, occupy a contested space in Pokémon design philosophy. Players who enjoy the unpredictability find these abilities add excitement and reduce the sense that battles are purely deterministic. Players who prefer strategic clarity find them frustrating, introducing outcomes that cannot be planned for or responded to. The useless abilities and the high variance abilities sit near each other on the spectrum of ability design, both representing cases where the mechanical function does not produce the kind of consistent, readable benefit that most players hope for when they check an ability description. Flame Body and Static and Poison Point and Effect Spore are abilities that inflict status conditions on opponents who make direct contact with the carrier. These abilities are genuinely useful in specific contexts, particularly in the early game where accumulating status conditions on wild Pokémon can slow down the pace of catching. A Pokémon with Flame Body that is attacked by a physical move has a 30% chance to inflict a burn on the attacker, which reduces physical damage output and drains HP each turn. The abilities are real and functional. Their limitations come from the rate at which they trigger and from competitive opponents who can avoid contact moves entirely, using special attacks or field hazards or status moves that do not trigger the ability. Against opponents who rely on contact moves, these abilities provide meaningful passive threat. Against opponents who avoid contact moves entirely, they provide nothing. The competitive relevance of contact-based abilities fluctuates with the prevalence of physical attackers in the meta. During periods when physical offense dominates, abilities like Flame Body provide reliable passive application of status that shapes opponent decisions. During periods when special offense or non-contact moves are more common, the abilities sit unused, waiting for contact that never comes. The abilities are not useless in any absolute sense. They are conditionally useful in a way that depends heavily on what the opponent chooses to do, which is true of many mechanics, but particularly limiting for passive abilities that require specific opponent behavior to activate. Poison Touch is an ability that gives contact moves a 30% chance to poison the target. The ability is outclassed by Poison Point in most respects, since Poison Point activates whenever the carrier is hit by a contact move from an opponent, while Poison Touch activates when the carrier uses a contact move against an opponent. The distinction matters in competitive play, where the carrier's offensive role determines which version of the mechanic is more likely to produce useful results. Poison Touch has had occasional use in competitive contexts, where specific Pokémon combine it with a moveset designed around frequent contact, but the 30% rate means that any given attack has a 70% chance to produce no additional effect. Over many turns, the poison application becomes likely, but competitive battles are often decided in few enough turns that the accumulation of probability does not always produce the desired result before the battle ends. Thick Fat is an ability that halves the damage taken from Fire-type and Ice-type moves. This is a genuinely useful ability that provides meaningful defensive coverage against two common offensive types. The Pokémon that carry Thick Fat include several creatures whose design benefits from the additional resistance, allowing them to fill defensive roles more effectively than their typing alone would permit. Thick fat is not in the category of useless abilities. It is listed here not to describe uselessness, but to contrast it with the abilities that occupy that category. The difference between thick fat and illuminate, between flash fire and run away, is not merely one of power. It is a difference in design clarity, in how precisely the ability's function serves the Pokemon's role in the game's systems. An ability is most useful when its function aligns with the situations the carrier is likely to encounter. Thick fat protects against fire and ice damage, and the Pokemon that carry it tend to be creatures that would otherwise be exposed to those types more than their defensive stats can comfortably handle. The ability solves a problem the Pokemon actually has. Runaway solves a problem that the game rarely presents. The design alignment between ability and Pokemon is one of the more reliable predictors of whether an ability will feel meaningful or vestigial, whether it will define how a Pokemon is used or sit quietly in its ability slot without ever being noticed. The best abilities in Pokemon feel inevitable, as though the Pokemon could not have been designed any other way, as though the ability and the creature arrive together as a single coherent idea. Levitate on a flying-type Pokemon feels inevitable. Swift Swim on a rain-based special attacker feels inevitable. Intimidate on a physically imposing leader of a group feels inevitable. These abilities do not require explanation because the connection between the mechanic and the creature is immediately legible. The worst abilities, the ones that feel useless or misplaced, are the ones where that connection is absent or broken, where the mechanic and the creature do not obviously belong together, where the ability exists not because it was the right fit for the Pokemon, but because the design process produced it and assigned it and moved on. There is a small set of abilities that represent what might be called philosophical uselessness, abilities whose function is real and whose effect occurs but whose outcome does not produce anything that meaningfully changes the flow of a battle. Hydration is an ability that cures the carrier's status condition at the end of each turn during rain. The function is genuinely useful in doubles, where setting up rain and protecting a key Pokemon from status conditions could sustain a strategy across many turns. In singles, the curing at the end of each turn means that a Pokemon afflicted by sleep wakes up at the end of the turn it fell asleep, effectively converting sleep into a one-turn inconvenience rather than a potentially decisive condition. This sounds like excellent protection, but the practical consequence in competitive play is that opponents who understand hydration will not use sleep against a hydration carrier during rain, rendering the immunity academic. And opponents who are not using sleep are not creating the condition that hydration addresses. The ability is theoretically powerful, but practically anticipated, its most significant effect being that opponents avoid the interactions it would neutralize. Leaf Guard is the grass-type equivalent, curing status conditions at the end of each turn during harsh sunlight. The same analysis applies. In Sun, a Pokemon with Leaf Guard cannot be afflicted by status conditions in a way that persists. Opponents who understand this will not attempt to use status against a Leaf Guard carrier during Sun, removing the scenario the ability was designed to address. Outside of Sun conditions, Leaf Guard does nothing. The ability is dependent on weather that must be maintained present against opponents who may not use the strategies it counters, and absent in scenarios where status conditions would otherwise be threatening. The conditions required for Leaf Guard to matter rarely align with the situations where status immunity would change an outcome. Vital Spirit is an ability that prevents sleep, a permanent immunity rather than a reactive cure. Sleep is a significant status condition in competitive play, and immunity to it sounds like strong protection. The problem is that the moves and mechanics that cause sleep are managed by most competitive players with awareness of which Pokemon can be put to sleep and which cannot. A Pokémon known to carry Vital Spirit will not be targeted with sleep moves by opponents who have done their research. Against unprepared opponents, or in formats where sleep is common, Vital Spirit provides real protection. Against prepared opponents, it is an ability that preemptively solved a problem nobody was going to create. The value of the ability depends almost entirely on the opponent's approach, and in competitive contexts where opponents are well prepared, the value diminishes significantly. Pure Power and Huge Power are abilities that double the carrier's physical attack stat, among the most powerful multiplicative boosts available through any passive mechanic in the game. These abilities are not useless by any definition. They are extraordinarily powerful on the right Pokémon and have defined competitive strategies across multiple generations. They are mentioned here to frame a different observation about what makes an ability feel purposeful. Pure Power and Huge Power work because they are attached to Pokémon whose other stats support the use of the ability's boost. Azumarill with Huge Power has enough bulk to survive hits and enough move pool access to take advantage of the attack boost. The ability and the Pokémon are designed together in a way that makes the combination functional and threatening. The contrast with abilities that provide significant effects to Pokémon that cannot take advantage of them is instructive. A hypothetical Pokémon with huge power but extremely low attack and no useful physical moves would have an ability that doubles a small number into a slightly larger small number, producing a boost that sounds impressive and accomplishes little. The ability would not be useless in the technical sense, but the Pokémon's other limitations would prevent the boost from producing the outcomes the ability theoretically supports. This version of uselessness, where the ability is functional but the Pokémon's broader design prevents the function from mattering, is less common in Pokémon than the varieties examined throughout the evening, but it represents the outer boundary of the concept. An ability that does something real can still fail to produce useful outcomes if the creature carrying it lacks the supporting qualities needed to translate the ability's function into results. The design of abilities in Pokémon is ultimately about creating meaningful choices, giving players options that require knowledge and judgment, rewarding the player who understands not just what an ability does in isolation, but how it interacts with the specific Pokémon carrying it, the specific moves that Pokémon can use, the specific formats in which it will compete, and the specific opponents it is likely to face. The abilities that succeed at this are the ones that feel inevitable, that define a Pokémon's role in a way that makes the ability and the creature inseparable in the player's mind. The abilities that fail at this are the ones examined throughout this evening, abilities that exist without quite serving, that were designed with purposes that the game around them did not fully support, or that the game subsequently changed in ways that left the ability stranded. Every ability that does nothing, truly nothing, was once an idea that someone thought would matter. The history of useless Pokémon abilities is the history of the gap between what was imagined and what the game could support, between intentions drawn up in development and the complex, evolving world that those intentions had to survive in. That gap is not a failure. It is a record, a trace of every version of the game that existed before the one that players know today. The abilities that no longer function as designed are fossils in their own right, remnants of a game that kept growing while certain of its components remained fixed, present in the code and on the stat screen, waiting patiently in the way that things wait when they have nowhere they need to be. There is a particular kind of Pokémon that seems built for a role the game never quite gives it, a creature whose design suggests one kind of competitive presence, while the ability it carries quietly redirects it towards something else entirely. Farfetch'd received the ability Keen Eye in its earliest appearances, an ability that prevents the reduction of the carrier's accuracy stat. On the surface, this sounds like protective insurance, a guarantee that moves will land as reliably as their listed accuracy promises. In practice, Accuracy reduction is one of the less common strategies in competitive play. The moves and abilities that reduce accuracy are present in the game, but they are not central to most competitive approaches, and building an ability around preventing something that rarely happens is building an ability for a world that does not quite match the one the game presents. Keen Eye on Farfetch'd does not make Farfetch'd better at anything Farfetch'd would otherwise be doing. It defends against a threat that most opponents never use, leaving the ability slot effectively empty in the vast majority of encounters the creature enters. The irony of Keen Eye on a Pokémon whose name and design evoke precision and awareness is not lost on players who read carefully. Farfetch'd carries a leek, a vegetable used as a weapon, in a way that suggests the creature is resourceful, alert, scrappy. Its design implies a fighter that uses what it has with more skill than its modest stats would suggest. Keen Eye sounds like it belongs to that character, but the ability's function, preventing a stat reduction that most opponents never attempt, does not add to that character in any meaningful way during battle. It is thematic dressing without mechanical consequence, a detail that fits the creature's personality and fails to fit the competitive reality in which that creature operates. Later generations gave Farfetch'd an evolution and a more interesting ability in Galarian form, and the original line received updates that made its design feel more complete. But the original Keen Eye sits in the ability slot of countless Farfetch'd across many generations, present and purposeless, a mechanic that fits the narrative and fails the game. Hustle deserves deeper examination than its earlier mention provided, because the ability represents a specific and fascinating kind of design failure, where the two halves of a trade-off are not balanced against each other in a way that most players would accept. The attack boost is 50%, which is transformative on Pokémon with already respectable attack stats, but the accuracy reduction of 20% means that a move with perfect accuracy suddenly connects only 80 times in every 100 attempts, and a move that already has 90% accuracy connects only 72 times. The math compresses quickly into a recognition that missing in competitive Pokémon is extraordinarily costly. A miss at the wrong moment, when the player needed to secure a knockout or stop a setup, can change the outcome of a battle entirely regardless of how powerful the move would have been. The Pokémon that carry Hustle tend to fall into two camps: those whose other qualities make the accuracy trade-off manageable, and those for whom the trade-off is simply too steep. Deino and its evolutionary line carry Hustle as a possible ability, and for Hydreigon specifically, the high base attack combined with a wide physical move pool creates a scenario where the boost is genuinely significant, and the accuracy reduction is painful but potentially manageable against opponents not running moves that exploit the missed turns. The Nidoran line carries Hustle as well, and on the fully evolved forms the story is similar. Meaningful attack boost, real accuracy cost, a net effect that players assess differently depending on their tolerance for variance. The deeper issue is that Hustle competes directly with other abilities that provide attack boosts without accuracy reductions. Sheer Force, which removes secondary effects from moves in exchange for a power boost, is cleaner and more reliable. Life Orb as a held item provides a consistent damage increase at the cost of recoil. Against those alternatives, Hustle's combination of higher boost and higher cost sits in an awkward position, attractive on paper and frustrating in practice. Players who prefer reliability over ceiling will always choose the alternative. Players who accept the variance often find that the missed turns arrive at exactly the wrong moments. Slow Start's companion in the category of abilities that harm legendaries is one that received far less attention but is worth sitting with for a moment. Regis, Regirock, and Registeel are legendary constructs, ancient golems that carry a kind of mechanical dignity in their design, Their abilities in various appearances include Clear Body, which prevents stat reductions caused by opponents, a genuinely useful passive trait. But in one specific game context, the means by which these creatures had to be obtained involved interacting with mechanics that introduced conditions affecting their utility. The legend of the Reggie Trio is not about harmful abilities in the same direct way as Slow Start, but the pattern of legendary creatures whose usefulness is constrained by design decisions that the competitive community has consistently noted is a recurring one throughout the series. Zacian and Zamazenta, in their crowned forms, carry abilities that actively boost them, so the pattern does not hold universally. But the history of legendary Pokémon, whose mechanical design undercuts their narrative power, is long enough to be notable, a recurring reminder that the designers must balance the story they want to tell about a creature against the mechanical reality of what that creature can do in battle. When those two things point in the same direction, the result is a legendary Pokémon that feels as powerful as it is supposed to feel. When they diverge, the result is a creature whose mythology exceeds its mechanics, whose place in the lore suggests significance that the ability system quietly contradicts. Moody is an ability that occupies a unique position in the ability taxonomy, one that is not useless in any ordinary sense, but whose design has been so contested that it has been banned from most competitive formats, effectively removing it from the game in the contexts where it would otherwise be most visible. Moody raises a random stat by 2 stages and lowers a random stat by 1 stage at the end of each turn, producing enormous swings in a Pokémon's capabilities with no player input or control. The ability is powerful in the sense that the boosts it provides are significant, but the randomness of which stat is boosted and which is lowered means that Moody battles often feel less like strategic contests and more like dice rolls. A Pokémon with Moody that happens to boost its evasion several turns in a row while the opponent's attacks miss becomes effectively impossible to defeat through any conventional means. A Pokémon with Moody that boosts irrelevant stats while lowering critical ones is essentially self-sabotaging. The ban on Moody in competitive formats means that the Pokémon carrying it have lost access to their defining ability in the settings where ability choice matters most. Glalie, one of the primary carriers of Moody, carries other abilities as alternatives, so the ban does not render it entirely without passive traits. But the design of Moody itself, an ability created to introduce dramatic variance rather than strategic depth, sits as a counterexample to the principle that the best abilities reward knowledge and decision-making. Moody rewards neither. It simply generates outcomes, some positive and some negative, based on mechanics that no player controls. In that sense, it represents a kind of anti-design, an ability whose existence removes player agency rather than expanding it. The Pokémon that carry Moody include some whose other qualities are modest enough that the ability represented their primary competitive hook. Without it, they are straightforward if unremarkable creatures. With it, in formats that permit its use, they become sources of chaotic variance that most experienced players find more frustrating than engaging. The ability has its enthusiasts, players who enjoy the unpredictability and who find something appealing about a mechanic that can dramatically shift the balance of a battle in a single turn. But the competitive consensus is that Moody's variance is not the kind of variance that makes games more interesting. It is the kind that makes outcomes less meaningful, and that distinction matters in a game that has spent many generations developing tools for strategic depth. Wonder Room and Magic Room and Trick Room are field effects that change the rules of battle for a limited number of turns, creating conditions that alter what would normally be true about the game. Trick Room reverses speed order. Magic Room eliminates the effects of held items. Wonder Room swaps defensive stats. Each of these effects has specific implications for how Pokémon are valued under those conditions. A Pokémon with high special defense suddenly becomes defensively superior in Wonder Room. A Pokémon with a low speed stat suddenly moves first in Trick Room. The field effects create alternate valuation systems where Pokémon whose numbers are usually disadvantageous become advantageous, rewarding creative thinking about which conditions a team can maintain and which Pokémon benefit from those conditions. The abilities and Pokémon designed to exploit these field effects are genuinely interesting in the formats where those effects are consistently active. The problem arises with Pokémon whose design was clearly oriented around a specific field effect, but whose base stats or type or move pool do not quite deliver the performance that orientation suggests. A slow Pokémon with modest attack designed around Trick Room still needs enough offensive power to take advantage of moving first once Trick Room is active. A Pokémon designed around Magic Room still needs to be valuable even in the turns before and after the effect is active. The field effect creates a window of opportunity, but the Pokémon must be good enough to take advantage of the window, and creatures whose entire design points toward one field condition often find that outside it, they are simply slow or weak, or both without any compensating quality. The Pokémon that fit this description tend to cluster around Trick Room, since that is the field effect most frequently built around in competitive play. Several mid-tier creatures with low speed and moderate attack have been designed in ways that suggest Trick Room use without being powerful enough to justify the team slots their use would require. They are not quite useless. They do something, but what they do is narrowly conditional and not quite good enough to justify the investment even when the conditions are met. Anticipation and Forewarn were examined briefly earlier, but they merit deeper consideration because they represent a design philosophy that is genuinely interesting and genuinely problematic at the same time. The philosophy is that information is valuable, that knowing what threats are present changes how a player responds to them, that an ability which provides knowledge rather than mechanical benefit is still providing something of real worth. This philosophy is correct. Information in Pokémon battles is valuable. Knowing that an opponent's Pokémon carries a move that threatens the current field arrangement changes the decisions a thoughtful player makes about switching and positioning and move selection. The problem with translating this philosophy into an ability is that the information provided by anticipation and forewarn is available through other means that do not require spending an ability slot. Players who study the game know which moves the most common Pokémon typically carry. Competitive databases list the most frequent movesets for every Pokémon at every level of play. A player who does not know what threats an opponent's team might present has access to resources that will tell them, and a player who already knows does not need the ability to tell them again. The information value of anticipation and forewarn is real for players who are entirely new to the game and who have not yet built up the knowledge base to anticipate what opponents are likely to carry. For those players, a warning that a threat exists is genuinely useful. For players with significant game knowledge, the warning is redundant, confirming what they already expected. The ability design works for one audience and fails for another, and the audience for which it fails tends to be the one for which ability choice matters most. Casual players who benefit from the information warning are often not building teams around ability optimization anyway. Competitive players who are building optimized teams would not choose an information gathering ability when they could choose a direct mechanical benefit. The abilities end up in an awkward middle, genuinely useful to one group and irrelevant to another, with neither group choosing them as their primary ability in the contexts where ability choice is most deliberate. Trace is an ability that copies the ability of the opposing Pokémon upon entry, giving the carrier whatever passive trait its opponent possesses for as long as it remains on the field. This sounds extraordinarily flexible, an ability that makes its carrier as good as whatever it faces, adapting to any situation by taking on the opponent's strengths. In practice, Trace has genuine competitive use and is not in the useless category in any straightforward sense, but it reveals an interesting edge case of relative uselessness when it copies abilities that are themselves useless. A Porygon 2 with Trace, facing an opponent whose ability does nothing, whose mechanic sits inert in its slot, copies that inert mechanic and gains nothing from the copy. The carrier of Trace is then in the same position as the carrier of the original useless ability, holding a mechanic that does not function and wishing for something else. This cascading quality is one of the more unusual features of Trace. When Trace works, it works remarkably. Copying an ability like Speed Boost, or Intimidate, or Drought can transform the battle entirely, giving the carrier a trait that was never part of its original design. But when Trace copies a useless ability, the mechanic compounds the uselessness, spreading the inert quality from one Pokémon to two. The situation is not common. Trace usually faces opponents whose abilities are at least marginally functional. But the edge cases, where Trace copies Limber from Stunfisk or Levitate from Rotom Fan and gains precisely nothing, are a reminder that every ability, useful or not, exists in a system where other abilities can interact with it in ways that extend its effects in unexpected directions. Skill Swap is a move that transfers abilities between the user and the target, creating the possibility of strategic ability redistribution during battle. The same edge case applies. A Pokémon using Skill Swap to take an opponent's useful ability and give them a less useful one is a legitimate and sometimes powerful strategy. But Skill Swap that gives an opponent a useless ability and takes one in return is building strategy around a transfer that produces no meaningful harm to the opponent and no meaningful benefit to the user. The useless ability, passed around through Skill Swap and Trace, leaves traces of its inertness wherever it lands, a mechanical non-event that persists through interactions that were designed to make abilities dynamic and interesting. There is a cluster of abilities introduced in the 5th generation that were designed around a concept of weather, not as a temporary field effect, but as a permanent environmental condition, achieved through abilities that set weather upon entry and maintained it indefinitely for as long as the ability carrier remained on the field. Drought set perpetual sun. Drizzle set perpetual rain. Sandstream set perpetual sandstorm. Snow warning set perpetual hail. These abilities transformed competitive play significantly when combined with Pokémon designed to exploit the weather they created. Rain teams built around swift swim sweepers became dominant. Sun teams used the speed and power boosts that solar conditions provided. The weather abilities were strong enough that the 5th generation meta was described in terms of which weather condition dominated rather than which strategies or team archetypes did. This dominance led to a mechanical change in subsequent generations. Weather abilities were modified to set weather for a limited number of turns rather than permanently, preventing the indefinite maintenance of weather conditions that a single Pokémon's presence had previously enabled. The change was broadly considered positive for competitive diversity, reducing the dominance of any single weather condition. But the change also affected Pokémon that had been designed to exploit perpetual weather, creatures whose stat lines and move pools had been calibrated for a world where the weather they relied on lasted as long as they remained on the field. Those Pokémon did not lose their abilities. The abilities still set weather. But the weather now lasted 8 turns, or 5 turns without an extending item, rather than indefinitely. The Pokémon designed for a perpetual weather meta found themselves in a different meta, one where their primary advantage had been reduced, and their ability to support weather-based teammates had been meaningfully curtailed. The abilities themselves are not useless. Drought and Drizzle and Sandstream and Snow Warning still do something significant. But the relationship between these abilities and the Pokémon that carry them changed when the duration of weather changed, and creatures that had been designed with indefinite weather in mind carry abilities that are now notably less powerful than they were at the point of their design. The abilities provide a real benefit, but not the level of benefit their carriers were built around, leaving a gap between what the creature was designed to do and what the current game allows it to accomplish. Battery, examined in the context of Charjabug, represents a specific design decision worth expanding upon, because it reveals something about how Double's exclusive design sometimes underestimates the importance of singles compatibility. The decision to give Charjabug only Battery as an ability was presumably intentional, a way of making the middle stage of its evolutionary line feel thematically consistent with the battery imagery the whole line is built around. Charjabug stores energy. Its ability passes that energy to allies. The concept is coherent. The design intention is clear. But the execution means that any player using Charjabug in a single battle format, which is to say any player encountering Charjabug during the main story of the game where it appears, has a Pokémon with no meaningful ability at all. The thematic coherence was purchased at the cost of functional completeness in the format most players use most often. This trade-off appears in other places across the game as well. Several Pokémon have been given abilities that make thematic sense and create interesting possibilities in doubles while functioning as placeholders in singles. The designers are aware of this trade-off, and in many cases they have resolved it by giving Pokémon at least one ability that works across formats. The cases where that resolution was not applied, where a Pokémon was left with only doubles exclusive mechanics, tend to be the ones that generate the most discussion. They are not common, but they are consistent enough to form a recognizable pattern, a category of design decision that prioritizes doubles coherence over singles functionality, and leaves certain Pokémon mechanically incomplete in the more commonly played format. Power Spot on Stonejourner is the most complete example of this, because Stonejourner does not evolve out of its doubles limitation the way Charjabug does. Stonejourner is the final form of its line, a large standing stone Pokémon with respectable base stats in several categories. But the ability that defines its design, Power Spot, has no singles application. A player who builds around Stonejourner in singles has built around a Pokémon that contributes its base stats and nothing else, a creature whose passive trait exists in its data and nowhere else on the field. The base stats are high enough that Stonejourner is not entirely without use, but the absence of any ability means that every other Pokémon at a similar or lower stat level with a functional ability is at a systemic advantage. Abilityless Pokémon, even very large standing stones with high defense stats, are always at a disadvantage in a game built around the assumption that every Pokémon brings a passive trait to the field. The way that competitive formats and casual gameplay create different valuation systems for abilities is worth pausing on more fully, because it explains much of why the category of useless abilities exists at all. In casual gameplay, the early portions of the game in particular, the ability of a Pokémon rarely determines the outcome of an encounter. The primary player is likely more powerful than the wild Pokémon or trainer Pokémon they face. The level advantage compensates for mechanical inefficiencies, and the broad strokes of type advantage and move selection determine most outcomes. In this environment, an ability that does nothing in battle can exist without cost. The player does not notice because the ability's presence or absence does not change anything they directly experience. In competitive gameplay, where teams are built deliberately, where ability choice is one of the primary variables players optimize, and where battles are decided by margins thin enough that the difference between having an ability and not having one can determine the outcome, the calculus is entirely different. Here, an ability that does nothing is genuinely costly. It occupies a slot that a functional ability would have filled, and every functional ability provides some advantage that the non-functional ability does not. The competitive player choosing between ability options for a Pokémon that has Klutz as one of its options simply does not choose Klutz. The ability exists in the data and does not exist in the player's decision-making. It is pruned from consideration as efficiently as any irrelevant variable. This difference in valuation is one reason that the list of useless abilities looks longer from a competitive perspective than from a casual one. Honeygather and Runaway and Illuminate are not useless in casual play in any complete sense. They do things occasionally in contexts that casual players encounter. A player who wanders through tall grass with a Meowth using pickup will eventually collect items they did not have before. That is a real benefit. But the competitive player building a team around every advantage the system offers will not choose pickup when they could choose a mechanic that changes the outcome of battles. The competitives and casual valuations of these abilities are genuinely different, and the label of useless is more precisely the competitive label applied to abilities that only casual players ever intentionally use. There is a group of abilities that are not useless in any conventional sense, but that carry a specific quality of being deeply outclassed by related abilities that do the same thing better. Natural Cure is an ability that cures the carrier's status condition when it switches out of battle. This is a real and useful effect, providing protection against status-based attrition strategies and giving the player a recovery option that does not require spending a turn using a healing move. Natural Cure is a functional and occasionally valuable ability used in certain competitive contexts specifically because of the switch-activated curing it provides. The comparison that makes Natural Cure feel diminished is Regenerator, an ability that restores 1/3 of the carrier's maximum HP when it switches out. Regenerator accomplishes everything Natural Cure accomplishes, since switching out cures status conditions as a baseline game mechanic in most situations, and adds a significant HP recovery component that Natural Cure does not provide. A Pokémon with Regenerator that switches out returns to the battle with more HP than it left with, as long as it has healed the status before returning. Natural Cure provides only the status cure. Regenerator provides the status cure plus healing. Any Pokémon that carries both as options will use Regenerator in most competitive contexts. Natural Cure is not useless. It is outclassed by a superior version of itself that exists in the same game. The pattern of abilities being outclassed by stronger versions of their core concept runs throughout the ability pool. Keen Eye prevents accuracy reduction. Sand Veil provides evasion in Sandstorm. Neither is as broadly useful as Compound Eyes, which raises the accuracy of the carrier's own moves, or Sand Rush, which doubles speed in Sandstorm. The functions are adjacent, but the value is not equivalent, and in a system where players choose between options, the option that provides more value in more situations will almost always be chosen. The abilities that are slightly less useful versions of more powerful concepts drift toward the useless end of the spectrum in competitive contexts because the superior version is available, and choosing the inferior version is choosing to be at a disadvantage relative to what the system allows. The concept of ability transparency in Pokémon battles is one that shapes how useless abilities are perceived in practice. In competitive play, most experienced players know what abilities are common on any given Pokémon, and the presence or absence of a specific ability can be inferred from the Pokémon's behavior. A Pokémon that switches in and sets Sun is running Drought. A Pokémon that switches in against a Fire-type move and takes no damage is running a Fire-type immunity. Abilities reveal themselves through their effects, and knowledgeable players raid those effects to build their understanding of what they are facing. The useless ability is invisible in this framework. A Pokémon with Runaway switches in and does nothing special. A Pokémon with Illuminate wanders into battle without any visible effect. A Pokémon with Honey Gather participates in the fight without any passive trait revealing itself through any action. To a knowledgeable opponent, the absence of any visible ability could mean the Pokémon has an ability that has simply not been triggered by current conditions, or it could mean the ability is genuinely inert. The invisible nature of useless abilities is not necessarily strategic. It is simply a consequence of having mechanics that do not interact with anything that happens in battle. This invisibility can occasionally produce a specific frustration in casual play, where a player might wait through an entire match for their Pokemon's ability to activate, wondering if they missed the trigger condition, before eventually reading the ability description again and realizing there was never going to be a trigger. The ability that never fires is more disorienting than the ability that fires at the wrong moment. At least when an ability fires, the player knows it exists and is attempting to work. An ability that never activates leaves the player uncertain whether the mechanic is broken or simply irrelevant. Illuminate is worth one final careful examination because it represents a very specific kind of design archeology, a glimpse into a version of Pokémon game design that emphasized exploration and encounter management in ways that later games have largely moved away from. In the earliest games, managing encounter rates was a genuine player concern. Tall grass and water roots produced random encounters at rates that determined how quickly the player could travel and how much experience they accumulated. Players who wanted more encounters moved more slowly or carried repels for fewer encounters. Illuminate modified this system in one direction, increasing the frequency of encounters for players who wanted more of them. The design context made sense when it was created. Players who were actively trying to train specific Pokémon to higher levels wanted more encounters. Players looking for a specific rare species wanted more opportunities for that species to appear. Illuminate served these goals by increasing the encounter rate, making the grinding process slightly faster and the search for rare Pokémon slightly more productive. The ability was modest in its benefit and gentle in its application, a quality of life feature that helped players who wanted it and was simply ignored by those who did not. The problem is that subsequent games introduced repel alternatives, encounter-modifying items and mechanics, and eventually overworld Pokémon that appear on the field and can be seen before being encountered, eliminating the randomness that Illuminate was designed to help manage. When the mechanic that Illuminate interacted with was replaced or reduced, Illuminate's value went with it. The ability did not become useless because it was poorly designed. It became useless because the game outgrew the system it was built around. It is a quiet memorial to the hidden encounter system that defined Pokémon gameplay for many years, still present in the ability pool long after the specific version of that system it was built to assist has been replaced by something different. The Pokémon fan community has developed a tradition of speculating about what abilities certain Pokémon should have received instead of the ones they got, and these discussions are one of the more revealing forms of engagement with the game's design. When players discuss what ability would have made Regigigas competitive, they are engaging directly with the design principles that govern ability assignment. The most common suggestion is simply to remove Slow Start entirely, allowing Regigigas to operate as its stats suggest it should. Some players propose replacing it with a moderate passive ability like Huge Power, though that would arguably make Regigigas too powerful in the other direction. Others suggest an ability tied to the legendary's narrative, something that reflects its role as the creator of the legendary golems without penalizing its performance in battle. These discussions do not produce official results, but they reveal a shared intuition about what good ability design looks like and where the existing design has failed to achieve it. Similar discussions surround archeops, where the community consistently identifies Defeatist as the single point where an otherwise well-designed Pokémon fails to translate into competitive viability. The suggestions for replacement abilities tend toward offensive options that reward the Pokémon for maintaining health, the inverse of Defeatist's penalty for losing it. Moxie, which boosts attack when the carrier defeats an opponent, appears frequently in these discussions as a thematically appropriate replacement. It rewards the same aggressive style that Archeops' base stats are built around without punishing the creature for surviving battle. Whether such a change would be made officially is a separate question, but the community consensus about what the change should be suggests a clear understanding of what made the original design fail. These community conversations are not merely wishful thinking. They reflect a genuine engagement with design principles, an understanding of how ability assignment should relate to base stats and type and move pool and competitive role. The players who participate in these discussions have internalized the logic of Pokémon design well enough to evaluate its successes and propose improvements for its failures. The useless abilities generate this kind of critical engagement precisely because they are failures, cases where the design fell short of what the system should provide. Failures, examined carefully and discussed honestly, produce the kind of understanding that successes alone cannot offer. Thunderwave is one of the most used utility moves in all of competitive Pokémon, reducing the target's speed by half and introducing a chance to be fully immobilized each turn. The paralysis condition is devastating against speed-reliant Pokémon and useful against almost every other kind of opponent. The ability Limber was designed to prevent this condition. Before the type immunity that made Limber redundant on Stunfisk, Limber was a genuine defensive trait, providing insurance against one of the game's most impactful utility moves. The Pokémon that carried Limber could switch into Thunderwave without consequence, denying the opponent the speed reduction and immobilization that make the move so valuable. The transition from useful to redundant happened in one generation, a single mechanical update that changed the type immunity rules and left Limber behind. The speed of the transition is worth noting. An ability that was functional and occasionally valuable became completely redundant in the space of a single game release. The designers who made the decision to give electric types universal paralysis immunity were improving the internal consistency of the game's type mechanics, ensuring that electric types were protected from their associated status condition the way fire types and poison types already were. The improvement was correct. The consequence for Limber was not considered as a separate design problem. The ability was simply left in place while the mechanic beneath it changed. This is one of the more instructive examples of how useless abilities are created, not through carelessness at the moment of their design, but through later decisions that alter the context those abilities depend on without updating the abilities themselves. The design team making the paralysis immunity change was focused on type mechanics, not on which abilities those mechanics would leave redundant. The design team, working on which Pokémon should carry Limber, had made those assignments years earlier, in a different version of the game. The two decisions exist in different temporal layers of the game's development, and the gap between them produced an ability whose function was erased by a change it had no mechanism to account for. The deepest layer of the useless ability conversation is the one about what the presence of these mechanics says about the nature of the game itself. Pokémon is a game that presents itself as completable, as a system where every element has a purpose and every Pokémon has a place. The Pokédex suggests a world of intentional variety, each creature occupying its own niche. The competitive system suggests a balanced ecosystem where diverse strategies are viable and no single approach dominates entirely. The ability pool suggests a toolkit where every passive trait provides something meaningful to the creature it accompanies. The useless abilities quietly contradict this presentation. They are evidence that the game is not as completable as it appears, that some elements exist without serving a purpose, that not every Pokemon's ability provides the meaningful passive trait the system implicitly promises. This is not a criticism, but an observation. No game of Pokemon's scale and complexity can be fully intentional in every detail. The design decisions as made across many generations by many designers working within evolving technical and creative constraints will inevitably produce cases where intention and outcome diverge. The useless abilities are those cases made visible, documented in the data, and readable by any player who takes the time to look. What the useless abilities reveal, more than anything else, is that Pokemon is a human creation, built by real people making real decisions under real constraints, with real consequences that persist across years of play. The game is not a perfect system. It is an extraordinarily rich and interesting one, full of depth and variety and genuine strategic complexity, built by a team whose creative ambition has always exceeded what any single design pass could fully realize. The useless abilities are the traces of that gap, the places where ambition encountered the limits of execution, where a mechanic was designed and assigned and sent into the game, and eventually the game grew in directions that left the mechanic behind. There is something worth sitting with in that image. A game so large and so long-running that its own design decisions become historical artifacts, present in the current version, but belonging to an earlier layer of the system, remnants of a world that no longer quite exists, even though the game that world produced is still being played. The Pokemon carrying useless abilities are not malfunctioning. They are accurate. They carry exactly what they were given. The world around them is what changed, and they remain patient and specific, exactly as they were designed to be in a game that has long since moved on to being something else. The ability to sit with things that do not quite work, to examine them with curiosity rather than frustration, is one of the quieter skills that long engagement with a complex game produces. Players who have spent years with Pokémon have encountered enough useless abilities, enough redundant mechanics, enough cases where the game's design produced something unexpected that they have developed a relationship with these moments that is more patient than it might otherwise be. The first time a player discovers that their Rotom fans levitate does nothing, there is surprise and possibly frustration. The 10th time a player encounters a case like this, there is recognition of familiar quality to the discovery, and then curiosity about the specific story behind this particular instance of the pattern. What changed to make the ability redundant? What was the original intention? What other Pokemon share the same situation? The frustration resolves into inquiry, and the inquiry produces understanding. This is one of the ways that complex games grow their communities, by producing material for discussion that is rich enough to sustain conversation across many years and many players. The useless abilities of Pokémon are one small part of that material, a perpetually available source of examples for the larger conversation about how games are designed and how designs age. They connect players who discovered them at different times, in different generations, through different experiences, giving them a shared reference point for a shared kind of discovery. The community that discusses these mechanics has been doing so across many iterations of the game, across forums and videos and conversations at tournaments, and the conversation continues because the subject continues to be interesting and the game continues to be played. There is something deeply peaceful about understanding a system well enough to appreciate its imperfections. A system that appears perfect from the outside is a system not yet examined closely. A system examined closely enough always reveals places where the design did not quite complete what it started, where the intentions exceeded the outcomes, where the gap between what was meant and what was achieved is visible to anyone who looks carefully. Pokémon, examined closely, is full of these places. The useless abilities are among the most visible. They are not the only ones. They are simply the ones where the gap has a name, listed on a stat screen, available to be discovered by any player curious enough to read every description rather than stopping at the ones that seem immediately useful. The game that contains Truant and Slow Start and Levitate on Rotom Fan is also the game that contains Intimidate and Regenerator and Prankster, abilities so consistently useful that they define entire categories of competitive strategy. The useless abilities and the excellent abilities live in the same system, produced by the same design process, assigned by the same team of designers, making decisions about which creature should carry which mechanic and why. The gap between the two categories is not a gap in the quality of the thinking that produced them. It is a gap in how the game evolved around them, which changes were made to the system after the abilities were assigned, which intentions the game could fully support and which it could not. The excellent abilities are not excellent because they were designed more carefully. They are excellent because the conditions around them remained aligned with their function, because the game did not change in ways that rendered them redundant or inapplicable. Understanding this is understanding something true about all design, all creative work, all systems built by human hands. The outcomes are not always predictable from the intentions. The best design cannot fully anticipate every change that will happen to the context around it. The systems we build are finished, but the worlds they live in are not, and the gap between finished and unfinished, between static and evolving, is where the interesting cases appear. The useless Pokémon abilities are interesting cases. They are worth knowing, they are worth examining, and they are worth understanding as part of the larger story of a game that has been building and changing and surprising its players for many generations, a story that continues every time a new ability is designed and assigned and sent out into the world to be discovered by players who will read every description, notice every redundancy, and ask, as players of deeply complex games always do, exactly why this particular thing works the way it does. The question that follows naturally from this survey is whether useless abilities are a problem that should be corrected or a feature that should be accepted as part of the game's texture. Players who approach Pokémon primarily through competitive play tend to view them as problems, inefficiencies in a system that should be as balanced and purposeful as possible. Every ability slot occupied by a mechanic that does nothing is a slot that could hold a mechanic that shapes decisions and rewards knowledge. From a competitive design perspective, an ability that never influences outcomes is a missed opportunity to add depth and variety to the strategic landscape. The argument for correction is straightforward and has merit. Players who approach Pokémon through the lens of creative history, through the accumulated decisions of a game that has been developing for many years, tend to view useless abilities differently. They are not inefficiencies to be corrected so much as records to be read, evidence of every decision that was made and every context that has since changed. Removing Limber from Stunfisk or updating Levitate on Rotom Fan would be accurate and functional improvements. But they would also erase a layer of the game's history, a small but real piece of the story of how the game evolved. The useless ability is, in its own quiet way, a historical document. It says something about where the game was and how it changed and what was carried forward even when carrying forward no longer served the original purpose. The game continues to grow, and with each generation comes a new set of abilities, some of which will prove brilliant, and some of which will drift toward the category examined throughout this evening. The designers who create these abilities are working carefully, but they are also working within a system of accumulating complexity that no team can fully anticipate. Some of what they build will age well, and some will not. Some abilities will remain relevant across many generations, and others will become redundant when a type gains a new immunity or a mechanic is updated in a way that duplicates the ability's function. The useless abilities of future generations are being designed now by careful people who believe in what they are building, in a game that will continue to change around them in ways that nobody can fully predict. That is the nature of building something lasting. The choices made today will be read differently by the people who encounter them tomorrow, interpreted through contexts that did not exist when the choices were made. Every ability in Pokémon was someone's considered decision, a mechanic assigned to a creature with intention and care. The abilities that have drifted toward uselessness did not drift because the intentions behind them were careless. They drifted because the game around them kept moving while they remained where they were placed, fixed points in an evolving system, present in the code and on the stat screen, waiting patiently in the way that things wait when they have nowhere they need to be and something worth being, even so. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet moments, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Let it play while you rest. You might discover something gentle before sleep takes you again.